Thank you very much. Today, we launched the 6th annual report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, detailing our work over the past year. Our mandate is to collect evidence of the most serious international crimes in Myanmar, and unfortunately, what our report conveys is that the number of these crimes is only increasing. The armed conflict is increasing in intensity and in brutality, and crimes are happening more and more frequently. Civilians are often the victims of the armed conflict, not simply as collateral damage, but often as the targeted in the conflict. So, for example, aerial bombings have increased very substantially in this last year. In Kaya State, in February of this year, 4 children were killed and around 10 injured when fighter jets dropped bombs and deployed machine gun fire on the school. In Cayenne State, in September of last year, 2 children were killed and others, children and teachers, injured when the military reportedly dropped bombs on the village school. In Chin State, on the 15th of November of last year, 8 children and a teacher were killed and others injured after an aerial attack on the school. We've also seen incredible brutality by different actors on the ground against opposing forces. So, for example, there was a videotape that circulated earlier this year that showed 2 captured PDF fighters being hung between 2 trees, and a fire built underneath them, and then the soldiers burned to death. It's incredible, not just the level of brutality, but the obvious feelings of impunity of those that committed the offense, that they actually would videotape what occurred and then put it on social media so it would be broadcast. Similarly, and unfortunately, we have a video that showed resistance forces beheading 2 captured soldiers in Lokau in Kaya State in November or December of last year. So this kind of incredible brutality is going on. Yesterday marked the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. And obviously, those conventions are designed to put rules on how conflicts are conducted. Civilians cannot be, non-combatants cannot be the intended targets of armed conflict according to the Geneva Convention. Soldiers that are captured, that are hors de combat, cannot be victimized. But we see this happening over and over again in Myanmar and unfortunately in many other places in the world. But I think the message for us is that we have to continue our work to try to bring some end to this cycle of impunity. And our report talks about our efforts, to continued efforts to share evidence that we have collected and analytical products with 3 ongoing processes, judicial processes that are now dealing with the Rohingya crisis. And this would include the federal prosecutor in Argentina, the International Criminal Court, which has an investigation about the Rohingya, and also the case at the International Court of Justice, the Gambia versus Myanmar, which concerns state responsibility for genocide. We've shared over 260 packages of evidence and that includes analytical products with these processes, in the hope that our evidence will help lead eventually to justice in these proceedings and in other proceedings. So I thank you very much and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this update. I also would like to remind you that yesterday, in a statement, we have been, joining what Nicholas just said, we've been condemning in the strongest terms the escalation of violence that has led to heavy civilian casualties in the country in recent weeks. Sorry. These incidents are part of a deeply concerning trend in the intensifying conflict, with civilians bearing the brunt of a conflict that has upended millions of lives. lives. We remind all parties, as we've just also heard, we remind all parties to the conflict of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian properties. Parties should also allow all communities to safely access humanitarian aid. Amid the worsening situation, 18.6 million people require humanitarian assistance, 6 million of them children. And again, as we have heard about Sudan, this is another humanitarian needs and response plans which remains completely underfunded with only 21% or 214 million of the required 994 million received 8 months into the year. More resources are urgently needed to assist the 5.3 million people in need across the country. And I'll open the floor to questions now in the room first. Looking at our journalist there? No? Okay, so let's go to the platform. Robin Miller is our correspondent of AFP. Robin?
Thank you. The report documents torture and sexual crimes in detention. Very specifically, regarding children, what was done to children and how young were those children? And can you specify who is doing this? Thank you.
Well, the crimes in detention that we are reporting on, generally, almost all of them are in detention facilities run by the military junta. I don't have the exact age of the children that were involved, but also often we see parents arrested and their children brought with them. We also see very young teenagers arrested and put in detention.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, Lisa Schlein, Voice of America.
Thank you. Yes, good morning. I was wondering whether the increasing brutality, some of the increasing brutality you talk about, may be a consequence of what we've been hearing, that the junta in some areas are losing their battles against the civil uprising that has been going on and increasing as well, whether this is one of the things that are happening. Do you see any kind of a turnaround in terms of international concern regarding the Myanmar situation, whether there are more countries that are not supporting the junta in the way that they have? Is this giving you any sort of hope? And what about the ongoing arms trade? Is that lessening, or is it continuing in a very large way? Thank you.
One of the things we're looking at is the supply of weapons and generally the support for crimes. Where is it coming from? What is the intent of that support? I think there's no doubt that the military, the junta, is becoming more desperate. And we've seen, for example, this big increase in the use of aerial bombing. And the targets of these bombings are usually civilian targets. Schools and churches and hospitals are often the only structures in the area, and those are the structures that are major structures that are being bombed. So civilians are bearing the brunt of what's happened. And similar, going back to the last question on detentions, I think it is partly a response to the desperation of the current regime that we see so frequently. Those that are put into detention or tortured in an attempt to extract information. There is sexual violence that's occurring in that detention, and the threat of sexual violence is extremely common against all of those detainees. So to answer your question, absolutely, I think that the desperation of the regime is creating more ferocity, more brutality in their attacks against the civilian population. But I would add that we're also seeing very concerning an increase in violence and brutality by opposition forces, and we're very concerned about that also.
Robin, you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. So on these serious crimes, which countries have influence with the Myanmar government and could perhaps get them to change their ways? Are they doing so? And if not, why not?
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to go into too much of the political analysis because that's beyond my mandate. But I would say that absolutely, the countries of the region have all expressed their concern with the violence that's going on in Myanmar. And in fact, ASEAN, a very key player in Myanmar, has said from the beginning it reached this 5-point consensus, that the junta itself signed on to the 5-point consensus. And the very first point is end the violence. But we see instead an increase in violence, and we see an increase in the violence targeting civilians. So I think absolutely it's time for ASEAN to put some bite into its consensus. It's not enough simply to say we support ending the violence. There have to be steps taken to ensure that, in fact, the violence is ended. And we believe that a key part of that effort to end the violence is to make it clear that those who are responsible for the most serious international crimes will be held to account. So we call on all the states in ASEAN to support our efforts to collect evidence of these crimes. We're the only ones out there collecting the evidence. No one in the country, the regime is not going to, the junta is not going to collect the evidence. Support our efforts to collect the evidence so that perpetrators or potential perpetrators know someone is watching, someone's collecting the evidence, someday you may be held to account.